um, I have some morning ramblings, as it were, and y'all might actually get a chuckle out of this. Some folks in the astrophysics community might actually want to perk your ears up for a second. I know my voice is a little bit hard to hear in, but I'd appreciate it if you give me a try. So, I was in the depths of my insanity, we'll call it, just doing some astrophysics and whatnot. Nuclear physics specifically, thinking about certain things, certain aspects, doing mathematics and whatnot. And, reminiscing on some things that I had learned when I was a young man and certain ideas I'd conceptualized as a young man. And I was sitting there chunnering with it over, with Gemini, Google's Gemini. And I had an epiphany, rather, as it were, that the folks at ITER and the tokamak research team and all them, the reason why you're having difficulties, and it was quite literally a matter of actually looking at the physics of fusion itself. See, fusion creates its own energy field, electromagnetic flux, as it were, and it interacts with the electromagnetic flux of the environment around it. Even inside of a magnetic bottle. And I want to point this out, that magnetic lines, magnetic fields, may or may not interact with each other depending upon what frequency they are on. However, fusion plasma crosses the gamut of electromagnetic fields, all frequencies, in that plasma because of its interactions. As such, it interacts with all frequencies, not just the magnetic bubble. So while your magnetic bubble might be containing the plasma in its shell, it's still trying to move around because it's interacting with those other plasmas. Not those other plasmas, those other fields. And this is in turn doing work. Now, this is why the Z-pinch is brilliant. I'll give them that. And this is also why I believe that what you guys are building by creating fusion devices in that containment zone is more akin to what I had previously described as a star drive, rather than what is what you guys are trying to do with this, fusion reaction in order to basically heat up water with, heating up heavy water sort of thing, or energizing a different coolant source to then heat up water. I think you're going in the wrong direction, because what you're looking at is as a sole power source, when in reality, fusion itself, stars, are literally motors, or rather, not motors, they're more like the rotors on an electric car motor sort of thing. It's kind of like the rotors on that, and the galactic current sheet itself is the embouchure that's moving that's being moved, or you're moving because of it, sort of thing. So you could be the embouchure, and the galactic current sheet itself is the stator. All right, think of it like that. The fusion that's happening in our star is pulling our whole solar system through the galaxy. Of course, it's not a tuned fusion. So a tuned fusion would be something where you're actually manipulating the frequency the fusion is reactant to, and it could therefore couple with the gravitational pull of the electromagnetic current sheet that is created by the galaxy itself. It ripples out from the center. But this is all physics that we've all understood for a while now, is more than likely. In fact, it's actually proven out in a lot of different situations, a lot of different experimentation. So I'm not the first to actually make a supposition on this. However, I'm one of the first to make a supposition that because of the actual idea itself, you're going in the wrong direction. That direction being trying to turn it into electrical power rather than utilizing it as an electrodynamo. This is why I said Z-Pinch probably has it right. Zip or Zep Energy Solutions or whatever. I can't remember. I just watched a video on it. My brain's, like I said, like buckshot. It's kind of scattered. But this is where that Z-Pinch actually makes sense, because you're using the rebound of the fusion. However, you got to remember, what is the closest effect on that fusion plasma? What is the closest cosmic effect on that fusion plasma? That's our planet's gravity. This is why the plasma in the tokamak reactor reacts down at the bottom in its most brilliant fusion, rather than up at the top where it should be, where you'd get the bubble effect. It's specifically because of that you're seeing the effect further down the magnetic bubble. It's because of Earth's gravity and the electrodynamo of Earth itself. That electromagnetic sphere that is pulling everything to it. Plasma is no different. It's pulling it down. It's pulling on the weight of that plasma. And that plasma is pulling back on it. So it's attracting each other, even through that electromagnetic bubble that you've got made. Powerful as it might be, there's still that subtle interaction, which is going to, like I said, going to create work. And that work is going to then throw and skew your readings on what your output is. And it might skew it further than what you realize. So, again, this is why I'm coming back to the effect of the plasma itself. The fusion reaction itself is an electrodynamo. That's where you should be turning towards more than trying to just, heat steam up. The most efficient you're going to get with a steam generator is a fission reactor. That's going to be your most efficient. It's just how physics works. However, that doesn't take away from fusion's usefulness. It can be used as an energy creation system, just through a different effect. And you have to build your machine to contain that effect as well, depending on what you're putting it on. So, with the Z-pinch apparatus, you should have your calibration so that it's going to contain more energy at the basin. Remember, every reaction done inside of a gravitational well has to have a basin. This is the same is true for chemistry, is the same as true for physics. Everything in a gravity well tends towards a basin effect. Everything will push down towards the bottom. So, your electromagnets on the bottom should be much stronger than the ones on the top. The ones on the top are just containing the pressure of the plasma. The ones on the bottom are containing the pressure of the plasma times itself in weight. Because you remember acceleration. This plasma is at acceleration. The back pressure of the reaction itself is the energy flow back into, and this is what is referred to as the Z-pinch reaction. The Z-pinch reaction adds to the energy flow through the machine because of its I think it's the Casimir effect. Don't quote me on that. My brain is, like I said, a freaking buckshot at a piece of paper. It's all over the fucking place. But I've got a relative understanding of how this is all working and why things aren't looking the way they should. Because again, it's fighting the rest of the cosmos. It's a motor inside of a gravity well. You want to have that motor in a base stasis, you need to be outside of any kind of gravity well. And when I say any kind of gravity well, that means outside of the galactic plane, outside of the universal tendrils, outside of actual gravitational and electromagnetic vortices, where you will actually be able to create a true electromagnetic bubble of perfect conformality, which is where there's gravity and electromagnetics working on all equal ends to pull outwards, whereas your bubble is containing inwards. That's how that will work. Other than that, you're not going to get that perfect reading that you see with how the mathematics works. Like I said, it doesn't mean that it's useless. In fact, it means it's much more useful than you're really paying attention to. Star Wars is real, basically. The fusion reaction itself is your motor. That's your embouchure. And then your stator is the galactic sheet itself. And you're just taking and vibrating that embouchure fast enough at the right frequency to catch and hold that stator to push you through open space. Boom, light speed is not even a question anymore. Theoretically, beyond 12.5 Mach, gravity does funny shit, and it starts to mess around with things inside of the internals of the craft, especially when there's no how would I says it, electromagnetic shielding. But inside of electromagnetic shielding, it's still the physical limit of causal matter in acceleration. So basically, you can't go beyond. It's like it's a terminal limit for how fast matter can go before it starts to transition into physics, no matter what you are doing. So about 12.5 Mach. And this is in a vacuum, mind you. Gravity starts to break down beyond that within the confines of the craft. You get gravitational anomalies, gravitational vortices and electromagnetic vortices that create differences in charge and differences in density of space itself. This creates time dilation. For instance, you could think, I need to stop the craft. It could take 30 minutes for that thought to both process and make it to your fingertips. In one of those particular gravitational vortices. So even though, observing it, you would see things moving super freaking slow, like you're moving through molasses and you're thinking through a fog, and everything slows down and it feels like you are literally pushing through the space with every force you've got to get through it, to just throttle back. That's pretty much the idea of what this would manifest as beyond 12.5 Mach, which is 12.5 times the speed of sound. Beyond this theoretical limit, even electronics begin to experience dilation to where they are not able to react as quickly either. Which means that frequency modulation, unless done at the points of contact, would be impossible. So, it would take a combination of pretty much linear ionization across the determined pathway future of the craft, and then collapse of that ionization in perpetuity at the acceleration of the craft to reduce that possible gravitational vortice and time dilation effect. In so much, you couldn't go beyond 12 Mach no matter where you're traveling. But that doesn't mean that the bubble has to travel that fast. So using that Alcubierre ideal of warp, where the front of the bow shock is what's pulling you, in the back of the bow shock is what's doing that. Now take into account that this is electromagnetic. This is what is forcing this. It's not some exotic matter needs to be the case. You're using electromagnetics. You're using fusion itself as your anchor point to create that, basically that propeller on the back end of your motorboat, if you want to put it that way. But it is basically pulsing at this at the gradient of the charge of the galaxy itself, allowing you to accelerate and to decelerate, depending on where you're traveling to. You could literally be leaping to the opposite end of the galaxy just for shits and gigglies to go and see a planet on the other side. It'd take you about a year and a half if you're traveling at these kinds of speeds. And with this kind of spatial manipulation, it is Einstein-Rosen-Bridge in a sense, to where you are utilizing fusion and electricity, but you're using frequency, but you're not using that as, you're not using that to relate information. You're using that to relate matter, mass. You're accelerating mass with that same, at the same time as you're using that electrical impulse, if you will, to, in effect, move space. The ship doesn't really move so much. It does move. It's moving really wicked fast. But it's more that space is moving around the outside of it. And space is moving around the outside of that bubble that ship is moving through as fast as it's going. Because again, you have to still have some acceleration to the body for it to manipulate and warp space. The space inside of the bubble needs to be warped as well as the space outside of the bubble, or you don't get traverse, which is the traveling between 2 points. You have to move the craft. It can't just stay sitting still. You're going to feel acceleration. You're going to have acceleration. It has to be the case. Otherwise, physics breaks down. Again, that does not mean that you cannot, in turn, accelerate space itself around that acceleration. It comes down to electromagnetic manipulation. If you're wrong with your trajectories, you could pass right through a planet, and all that planet would notice is gravitational anomalies. Not saying that would be a good thing. I'm saying that that's all that planet would experience, because space has moved around the outside of the craft. So the planet would end up, to your retrospect, becoming a donut. But to their retrospect, they just got hit by a particle. At most. The ionization basically ripped space apart around you and put it back together behind you. That cavitation is going to instantaneously create gravitational vortice. That gravitational vortice would be an anomaly that planet would experience, and of course that could be catastrophic, depending on how fast you're going, what the causality rate is relative to your causality rate, relative to the bubble's protrusion and the ionization of space in front. Plus, you'd have sterilized the planet anyway, so you really do have to be good with your calculations. But this all comes back to the point that fantasy is not really fantasy, when it's science fiction, because science fiction is just science fact waiting to become whole. It's just waiting to become reality. And that's why I look at a lot of science fiction stories and I'm like, how plausible is this? And yeah, very, very plausible, because of how physics works. I'm sure that the guys at the reactor facilities in their experimentation have already gone through this and observed the same things I have observed from millions of miles away over the interwebs through the YouTubes. Okay? And that's because of what I understand about physics. That's the only reason why I'm observing these things, because I can break down what I'm visualizing. What I am seeing visually, I can break down in my head and understand, okay, this is what this is doing, this is why this is happening, this is that and the others. That's why I said I know this is what's happening. The fusion is doing work that nobody prescribed because of where the fusion is happening. And it's the same thing with fusion and fission bombs. When we tested them atmospherically, you see the same physical effects as you would releasing air underwater, releasing explosive forces of any kind, releasing energy. When you release energy, this is how this works. Energy goes up, force goes down inside of a gravitational well. So in order to direct that energy downwards, you have to first be utilizing the same forces that would in turn direct that energy upwards. This is why it makes almost no sense the way things work. But if you watch the actual tokamak reactions at the ITER, or however you want to say it, okay? International Tokamak Experimental Research Facility. Basically, they say it in European. I don't speak the European language. That it's just go with it. Anyways, if you watch the fusion reaction that they have on YouTube, you can watch as the light portion, the visible light portion of the reaction, does the opposite of what you expect from a fusion reaction in atmosphere, and this is because of gravity. That visible light portion is a higher energy spectrum than the invisible light portion, which is more force. And that is directed down towards the basin, towards the ground, towards gravity, towards its gravitational well point. Why is that important? Because it shows the difference between a fusion reaction that is airburst close to the ground, uncontained, and the forces it releases, and a fusion reaction that is contained but still affected by the gravity that causes the same activity, only in an opposite direction. The force is directed down, the light and energy is directed up. And you see that in the difference in reaction. This isn't like I'm speaking Greek here. This is, you see it visually. You can actually visually see how this works in a tokamak, because they have the cameras in there and they have all this other stuff that's looking at the reaction as it happens. The magnetosphere that's holding all of that energy inside of it still is affected by outside magnetospheric manipulation. And that's every type. That's cosmic, that's geocentric, that's heliocentric, it's all the different magnetic anomalies, effects, what have you, are going to affect that plasma, even if it's not right on top of it. Still, if it's right on top of it, it's going to have the highest effect. You can see this in the way the plasma reacts. So this is why I have to say that another thing about what came to me was, this is why the threshold isn't going to be reached. It's for two reasons, particularly. One is you're trying to make steam. Stop trying to make steam. It's the piss poor application for a beautiful machine. Should be trying to utilize the force rather than the heat in order to create energy. And that force is electromagnetic in nature. Most predominantly because it's inside of a vacuum, inside of a magnetic toroid. So your force is going to be more related to the magnetic bottle, basically, rather than the atmosphere outside. So again, this is why the effect is different. Anyways, that magnetic force can be returned to the machine and then in turn returned to off-site or on-site gathering points. This is called electromagnetic reaping of electricity. And it's the same thing, the same principle that the pyramid idea of it being a power plant works off of. It's the same principle that earth power works off of. It's the same principle that has been proven out to be the case simply by one of the most well-known experiments ever envisioned and ever carried out. Specifically done so long ago that I'm surprised people just still have not paid attention to it. And that is the kite string with the key. Benjamin Franklin and his kite string with a key. Taking and putting a key up in the atmosphere, using that as a lightning, attractant, and then having that cord off to, try to bottle lightning sort of thing. It worked off the principle that if you have an electrode way up there in the atmosphere, the charge is cumulative as you go up. The further up against the atmosphere that you are, up in the atmosphere you are, the higher the charge, if you still have ground. Same principle. It's all an electrodynamo. That's what I'm trying to relate to the guys at ITER. That's what I'm trying to relate to the guys at other facilities. All the other facilities are doing research on it right now. You're onto something, but you're looking in the wrong direction. Look here, motherfuckers. I'm sorry I nerd out really hard on this shit, but it is so simple, it's brilliant. The biggest hurdle is gravity. It's the gravitational pull on that plasma that is making it so you get more light frequency down below and more force frequency up above. Use it to your advantage. Whatever electrostators need to be that place, but that's how that will actually not only balance the reaction, I'm sure, in some way, shape, or form, but it'll also give you the ability to reap energy from it, rather than trying to use the neutron flux to boil water. Sorry, but that's really, really inefficient. When it comes to fusion, that's really inefficient. Yes, you get more neutron production. However, in a fission reaction, you use some of those neutrons to create more fission, and that creates heat, thermal heat, which is also related to your coolant. Unlike in a fusion reaction, where all of that thermal energy is carried in that fusion plasma. It's not relating to your water. Only your neutron flux is. So there's another gradient that's going to end up causing a dip in your overall outcome, regardless of whether you get the water to boil or not. That's going to cut into your efficiency in massive amounts. In massive amounts. Thermal energy is way more reactive with water than neutron energy. Okay? That neutron flux that you get from the radioactive decay of fission and the mainstay of the radiation of fusion, that is going to not do as much work as in the fusion because of the thermal of the fission. You get more thermal in your fission than you do in your fusion, if you get what I'm saying. This is where the cold of fusion really kind of makes the big problem. Okay? This is why making steam out of it is the wrong direction to go. Electromagnetic interaction. Electromagnetic and electrodynamic reaping of the electron flux that also comes from fusion is the better option, because you're going to get more power from that than you are from just neutron flux. And I know it sounds insane and crazy and whatnot, but it does come together. Once you get plasma ionized and become fusion, you lose some, win some, and it's reductive. So, protons, you're going to have proton flux, you're going to have neutron flux, you're going to have electron flux. You can reap the electrons directly, the protons, you can cyclically reap that, but the neutron flux, it's the least relatant and the most energetic. So trying to capture that with a pipe of water isn't... I get it, I get the idea, it's just... You know, pure hydrogen to hydrogen, you know, deuteric fusion, proper deuteric fusion, which literally creates helium-3 and tritium. Hello, come in Berlin. It's the perfect clean system, yes. But at the same time, It's the most energetic if you use it right. The deuterium to tritium fusion system, though it's easier, there is a caveat. You lose a lot of energy, right? Lose a lot of that neutron flux. Ends up more as proton and electron flux. Use the electron flux. Reap that directly. You can reap that directly. And because you can reap that directly, you can also cyclically reap the proton flux, which is just ions. Whenever ions contact heavier matter, just standard matter, they knock electrons off, which creates electron flux, which we know as electricity. Thank you very much for coming to my TED Talk. I am Ye Old Guardsman Om, and y'all motherfuckers have a nice day.